one of the luxuries of giving myself all this time and being given all this time by the London Review of Books to talk to people is that you can sometimes just kind of mix it up and say, well, wait a minute, that's not true. And I really like the idea of being able to represent, to actually quote people's factually incorrect comments, and either leave them in and just allow the reader to do this, or to put a little footnote. So you're putting in what they actually believe, but you're not interrupting them, you just let them talk. But when it comes to actually writing the article, you put a little footnote in, talking about the actual situation. But that sort of space enables you to, rather than constantly attacking the person, you're just taking it all in, and hopefully being able to represent that to the readers, and hopefully taking the readers along with you. But also, I think people's lives are fascinating. Anyone's life is fascinating, and will tell you a great deal about the way both what is happening, what has happened, but also the way that people understand what's happened. And I think a lot of what I was writing about here was about people trying to make sense of their own personal history and how that wove in with sort of official history and the history that you read about in newspapers and see on the TV. I mean, there's this particular epiphany that I've been thinking about a lot in the past few years, but it actually happened quite a long time ago when I was living in Russia, and I went down to Kiev on the 10th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster and interviewed a lot of people who'd been affected by it, people who'd been sort of liquidating the consequences of it, people who'd been living in the town of Chernobyl when the reactor exploded. And after a while, I began to notice something quite strange about the answers they were giving to my questions, which was that they didn't seem to have a clear line in their memories between the negative effects of the explosion of the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl and the negative effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which happened at about the same time. In a way that seemed to them, and gradually came to seem to me, perfectly natural. They were merging these two events, and of course they were related, but they weren't quite mixed up in the way that people thought. You would ask somebody, what about the payments you received in compensation for what happened in the reactor, and they would start talking about how pensions had collapsed as a result of the Soviet Union falling apart. And lately, I've been thinking about this in terms of what's happened in this country. And I think people have lives are long. Lives have never been so long in this country, and people have been through a lot in their lives, and there are these different strands which are actually separate but might not seem to be separate to people because they're not academics and professors, and they're not constantly self-analyzing in that way. And the two particular strands I'm thinking of are the strand of cultural change, the way that for example, the kind of jokes that you used to grow up telling about how funny foreigners are and about how women are this and men are that don't seem so funny anymore. That sort of, quite strong cultural change. And at the same time, the economic change, the great transformation, the closing of the factories, the death of the high street, the homogenization of chains in the economy, and the death of small business. These two things, they're not necessarily clearly separated in people's minds. So a revolt against one might come to be seen as a revolt against the other. And one of the things I realized in working in the Soviet Union was that the kind of conventional classic reporting of a big social event, like the collapse of the Soviet Union, tends to be, quite understandably, focused on that moment and the difficulties for people. For example, their pension is suddenly reduced to a tenth or a hundredth of its previous value. Okay, that's clear, but I think the real poison for individuals who endure that kind of thing, especially when they're older, is that if you have an event like the collapse of the Soviet Union, perhaps the collapse of the British Empire, perhaps in 20 years' time we will look back on the era of the European Union in this way. It's not just in that moment. It retrospectively goes back through all the time that state existed and devalues the life that you've led. So if your whole life has been lived without you really thinking about it in this world of the European Union, and then suddenly it's being trashed, then it's not just the consequences in that moment of whatever might happen. It's also kind of saying your life wasn't quite as good as you thought it was. You weren't doing the right thing. You were behaving badly. You were behaving wrongly. And one of the effects, I think, of the Brexit experience has been for Remainers like myself to perhaps share some of the feelings that Leavers perhaps felt a little bit further back up the road, where, for example, a whole way of life in a mining village was destroyed. Not the EU's fault, but that's the kind of change that people might be looking for a scapegoat for. That it's not just that you lose your job in the pit. It's that kind of everything you've lived up to that moment doesn't seem quite so worthwhile because all the traces are gone, and coal is just no good anymore. And who's a miner these days? It's like your youth, your childhood. You're falling in love. You're getting married. You're having children. If the world that you live in, the cultural world that you live in, is gone, then that disappearance floods back into your past and degrades it.